The HR Happy Hour Network is sponsored by WorkHuman. The role of HR is changing fast, and leaders who move beyond administration into true business leadership will have the edge. WorkHuman Live is where that shift becomes real. 4 transformative days in Orlando built around the challenges HR leaders are facing right now. With 65 plus standout speakers, you'll get practical, research-backed insights you can use immediately, honest conversations with leaders under the same pressure, and a human-first experience designed to energize, not exhaust. It's why 93% of past attendees left inspired, and why you need to be here this April from the 27th to the 30th. Register now at workhumanlive.com and use code HRHappyHour before February 28th to save 20%. That's HR Happy Hour, all one word. Welcome to the HR Means Business podcast, which is part of the HR Happy Hour network. I'm your host, Mervyn Dinnen. Today, I'm welcoming back a friend of the podcast, shall we say. This is the third time he would have been on. Gary Cookson, who is a prolific writer, has just completed his 3rd book, which is about to be published, and we're going to be talking about that in a moment. His consultancy, Epic, are experts in workplace performance, and he partners with organizations helping to improve leadership capability, organizational performance, and culture. Gary, welcome back to HR Means Business. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Mervyn. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be back. Yeah, thanks for the nice introduction as well. And I'm not sure more I can add to that. We're going to talk a little bit about my research and my thinking into various aspects today. But my work is all about making work better for whoever's involved in that. It's a very broad church, and a lot of my specialisms have been in HR and L&D and in leadership development and in executive coaching and things like that. And I just partner with organizations who want to get better at such things.
Okay, that's what we want for all our organisations, particularly for the people who work within them. Your writing recently has been around kind of flexible working, and people might know you from your 2 books about that. But your forthcoming book is called The Squeezed Middle, and you're looking at kind of middle management. And that's obviously something that the HR is very relevant to HR. I mean, they are often middle managers themselves, but it's the way that they are able to, I suppose, align expectations and to bring management within the broader business. Now, you describe middle managers as the organizational value zone, but they're often the most squeezed and least supported group. Why do you think organizations consistently misunderstand where value is really being created?
There's a number of reasons for that. And some of that is structural, some of that is cultural, but the concept of what a middle manager is not an easy one for anybody to get their head around. It's a really ill-defined role, really vague, and it will be different in different organizations, but very few put the effort in, the intention into crafting what that role is. It's not seen as a destination role. It's seen as a stepping stone to something else. It's seen in many organizations as an overhead rather than a value creator. And where leadership needs to rightly prioritize the vision, the strategy, the mission of the organization, they forget about the people who make all that real. And that's not just the frontline teams. That's the middle managers who make sense of what's going on in the organization, who translate that into reality, who put it into something practical, who also manage the networks, manage the relationships across the organization. And a lot of what they do is really hard to quantify. It's invisible, emotional labor. It's not included in a job description. So it's hard to measure the value of it. And that's part of the problem we have.
And when you started doing the research for the book, was there something particularly that I suppose started you off on wanting to explore this kind of area?
Yeah, and it flowed a little bit from my earlier 2 books, which, as you mentioned, were on the subjects of remote and hybrid working, flexible working. And as I finished those, I was reaching a conclusion that there was still more to examine here, and particularly crucial was the role of managers middle managers or any managers in making work better, in being the cog in the organizational architecture from which everything flows. And I wanted to examine that in a bit more detail. So I did the research for this particular book. And what really surprised me is how much of that job, and I'd done it myself in the past, is invisible. That sense making, the calming anxiety, preventing conflict before it erupts. And we have a lot of people in middle management positions who've got a lot of responsibility, very little control, very little empowerment, very little autonomy to make those things work. They need to, otherwise organizations might well fall down. Middle managers, because of their unique position in the organization, will see wider than many other people can in an organization. They have relationships and networks with a much wider range of stakeholders than others might, and therefore they are uniquely positioned to make organizations flow better, but we don't always give them the credit for that or the support for that or the freedom to do that. So this book flowed nicely from the first two and tackles a different angle on the same problem.
Mm. I mean, the book focuses very much on, as you've said, the lived experience of kind of
Yeah.
being in the middle, rather than leadership ideals and kind of things that go with that. Um, what surprised you most about the I suppose the emotional and the psychological reality of middle management, particularly nowadays, where we're talking at a time when organisations are changing, shifting AI, and it's almost like the future is not really it's being almost created as we go.
Yeah, it is. And there is that mismatch, I think, and I've hinted at this already. There's a mismatch between what's written down on paper that a middle manager does and the lived reality of that. And that is very, very different. And I think what we do is we set middle managers up potentially to fail quite spectacularly by not telling them how to do the role. We focus on functional responsibilities. So I might be a middle manager with an HR responsibility, and my job description is packed full of all my HR functional responsibilities, or it might be IT or marketing, or you take your pick. Never usually says the stuff that middle managers do better than anybody else, do more than anybody else, and which makes a real difference from that emotional invisible labour that I talked about. And that was what surprised me first off, that everybody seems to know what a good middle manager does, and there are plenty of them out there, but they're doing it without any credit, without any recognition, without it being recognized as part of their job, an integral part of it. So that was the first big surprise there. The other big surprise was that we were very rarely preparing anybody to do that type of stuff. We prepare people to become a manager for the first time. We tell them how to do the policies, do the procedures, that type of stuff, how to motivate and influence people. We also prepare people to be an executive, to be a senior leader. There's a gap in the middle where work really gets done, where organizations really work and work better. Nobody prepares that group of people. There's a big gap there. And you also talked there about the pace of change, the growth of uncertainty in organizations. Middle managers are part of that, but rarely being given the structure or the framework with which to make that work, to help their teams to navigate that uncertainty. A lot is being left to chance, and that was a big surprise too.
Mm. And you've hinted already or mentioned about kind of invisible work,
Yeah,
and as you've said, yeah, a lot of what middle managers do doesn't usually appear in job descriptions.
yeah,
Some of the things, kind of things like de-escalating tension, you mentioned, translating strategy, also this kind of absorbing uncertainty, or almost a kind of buffer that needs to absorb that, because obviously our people can't really function in an air of uncertainty. So
yeah.
it is. Why do you think it's so hard in organizations, particularly, I suppose, for leaders and senior managers, and also for the workforce, to see this kind of quiet glue almost, the work that it's hard to see, but the value of it is huge.
Yeah, it's hard to see because it is invisible. For example, we might have a team in conflict with itself, and that conflict needs resolving, needs mediating before it erupts and shatters relationships. And a middle manager is likely to be the one who does that work. And the value comes in avoiding negative consequences rather than doing something that's tangible. So it's the absence of conflict that is the value in that particular example. And you can't write that down. You can't evidence that. There isn't a report that you can run or some data you can look at that shows you any of that. And that's one example of many examples of what middle management value is all about, that you only realize what they do when nobody does that anymore and problems start occurring. And we see this regularly with organizations that delayer and strip out middle managers and then have to put them back because they realize at that point, and only at that point, too late, what they were actually doing. It's not written down anywhere, not even spoken out loud. That's the problem.
Mm. Yeah, I get that. And in fact, in today's work environment, the skills are quite different. So you mentioned things like sense making and influence, which is kind
Yeah,
of we've been talking about a lot over recent years, but these are the skills of the modern leader and the modern manager, more
yeah.
than traditional, I suppose, command control and kind of top down. So what does something like sense making, what does it look like? What does good sense making look like in practice?
Yeah, it's an important thing to try and get your head around because it is procedural. It isn't about a process. There's no documentation that anybody could follow with that. But sense making is increasingly important in organizations because organizations are quite complex mechanisms anyway. They're a system of interconnected things. And very rarely are organizations completely clear and transparent. There's a lot of uncertainty in organizations, and meaning has to be built. It isn't always there from looking at a policy or a procedure. And then we've got other things like, I talk a lot about remote and hybrid working, and we spoke about that. You're not always with the people who you are working with. So you miss out on informal cues, body language, tonal changes, things like that. Managers have to exercise judgment an awful lot more than they might have done in the past. Middle managers have to make sense of a lot of different signals in the organization. And people also look to middle managers to make sense of change in organizations. Artificial intelligence being a really good and current example. It's worrying a lot of people. People don't necessarily know how it might change their jobs and what they do. They just know that it will. And a middle manager, again, uniquely positioned to make sense of that, to translate the organizational direction of travel on such things into the first step, the first practical action, to be with their team, to be the steady one when everybody else is wobbling, to put it in a wider context. That's what sense making is. It's a range of different things, all fitting under one umbrella heading to help people feel better in the workplace. And feelings, again, very intangible, very invisible stuff. And that, again, is part of the problem.
So, out of interest, do you think this means, that this makes middle managers more almost in the front line of something like AI, for example? Because leadership, senior management are obviously trying to work out how this is going to impact their business, the positives, the negatives, what it means for their people, and kind of they need, I suppose, policies and things and guidelines and is it the middle manager that's almost like the first one that almost kind of sniffs the change of the wind and says, look, we've got something coming up here that we need to spend quite a bit of time looking at?
Yeah.
Or is it something that suddenly it happens and it's just like, what do we do about it?
Well, both could happen in organisation. But let's take the first example. And middle managers, because of the way they are highly networked within an organisation, will see a wider picture than many others will. And what they can do, and you mentioned guidance and things like that, I think middle managers need to provide guardrails for their team, a safe space, psychological safe space for teams to know what they can do and what they control, what they can't do, what they can't control, and the boundaries in which they operate. And using AI as an example there, the organization might have a vague direction of travel about what it wants to do with technology and automation and so on. And a middle manager needs to translate that into something practical, something human. They also need to respect the emotions in the room and what the team might be going through, protecting the team from unnecessary panic, but be in that safe space to share the emotional certainty and worry that people might have about increased automation. They then need to create space and time for their teams to experiment with artificial intelligence, to figure out from all the things that it could do, what are the most important things that we do? What are the 20% of things that take up 80% of our time? How do we identify and focus on those? What if we get things wrong? How do we learn from that? What if we don't want to do something? What else do we do? Middle managers need to hold that space for people. They need to have that framework, not a policy, not a strict procedure, but guardrails to keep people safe, but give them room to experiment, room to try new things, and then to share the learning from that, maybe as wide as a whole organization. That's the key role of middle managers, and no one else in the organization can do that.
Mm. Yeah, management is a strange thing. I remember going back to, well, when I started in the world of work, it was in a professional services organization, quite structured. Um, and it was, I remember one of the partners saying to me one day, everybody wants to be a manager. Everybody wants to be a manager. There's a status about it, but manager is kind of like all of the responsibility, and he said it, with little of the rewards.
Yeah.
Um, and it's kind of, I'm leading into my next question, which was about middle managers are often caught, I suppose, in the middle. Senior ambition and frontline reality. I think I saw it written as, and how do they decide? I suppose when to align, when to translate, how to push back, and keep trust on both sides. Obviously, the people and senior management.
Yeah, and that's very, very common. And that phrase that was mentioned to you about everybody wants to be a manager, I've encountered that phrase as well. It was drilled into me from a very early age that you start off at the bottom of an organization, you work your way to the top. And that's not necessarily the case. I'm not sure it ever was the case, but it was a widely held belief. We need to see management as something that some people will be good at, some people can be trained to do better, and that some people should be kept well away from. And there's a lot of organizations that don't have that conscious focus on separating those groups of people out, and they reap the consequences of that. And that's part of the problem we've got, that we don't think at a very early age that not everybody's going to be cut out to be a manager. And there's some people we need to keep away from managing other people, because managers, whilst they can do a lot of value creation, a lot of brilliant things, can wreak untold damage on individuals as well. I think perhaps, Mervyn, I've gone off at a tangent there. What was the rest of your
No,
question?
okay. It was basically, I suppose, when to push back without damaging trust on either side, be it the workers the workers, be it the workforce or the senior management, and kind of when to align, when to. I suppose politically they're kind of in the middle, it's kind of, how do they decide? If they have ambition to be a senior leader, then how can they realize that if they're caught, I suppose, in the middle?
Yeah, I think a model that springs to mind for helping people think through this is David Rock's SCARF model, and there's some elements of the SCARF model which are helpful here, particularly the C of certainty, and I think that's really helpful. We don't exist in a certain world, but there's certain things that you do know and some things that you don't, and I think really important for any middle manager is to focus on what certainty means for their team, for themselves, for the wider organization, to identify what's known and what isn't, what is set in stone and what's fluid and flexible, And to say all of that, to fill in any gaps in people's minds that might be drawing worry towards them, to identify what they can negotiate on and what they can't negotiate on, and communicate that honestly, to make sure that the way they make decisions is reliable and certain in itself. So base that on values, whether that's personal or organizational stuff, rather than preference. To avoid as well carrying messages uncritically, to interpret them, not just relaying messages. And you mentioned there pushback. There might well be times where pushback is important. In one of the case studies in the book, somebody said to me that what they see a middle manager as being is the person who's going to ask the awkward questions. Don't be afraid of appearing to be the stupidest person in the room. And I was taken aback by that phrase initially. The more I think about it, I understand what they meant there. This is about modeling curiosity and inquisitiveness and courage to challenge, rather than blind obedience and blind acceptance of such things. It's making sure that people fully understand what's going on, instead of having half of the picture and going off and getting something wrong because of that. And that could be seen as pushback, could be. But I think it's showing vulnerability. I think it's showing influence. I think it's showing intent to get better. And if a middle manager does want to do that pushback, then being prepared to ask questions in a curious manner rather than a judgmental manner is one way in which they can do that, both up and down and across the organisation.
Mm. Yes. Now, of course, we've mentioned already kind of AI and your previous research on hybrid working. So I did want to bring them together in a question.
Yeah.
But I mean, both of these, I suppose, have added complexity to the middle manager role.
Yeah.
Whether it's monitoring and supporting performance at a distance, interpreting data. How are they? How do you think these shifts are changing from your research around middle management? How are these shifts changing that kind of pressure expectation, the judgment calls, that the day-to-day decisions that middle managers have to make?
It's a really great point, and there's a few ways in which that's happening. Middle managers, or indeed any manager at all, now does a lot more translated work because of the distance that we might have between people, geographical distance. They need to make sure individuals are aligned, that team relationships work, and that teams don't exist in silos, but there is an element of consistency across the organisation, and making sure the interfaces work better. Because if there's no conscious effort on those things, that will fall down. We work in a context where clarity isn't guaranteed. So a middle manager is well placed to deal with that. They also need to become much more adept at reading emotional cues, sensing people's mood, sensing people's sense of well-being through a screen, which isn't something people have been very used to doing until the last few years, but now middle managers need to do that much more than often. Given the wide base of their network, they're in contact with lots more people than anybody else will be in an organisation. So there's that. And then the cultural piece is an interesting one too. How the team connects with each other, how the team connects with the wider organisation, what the team shares with the wider organisation, how does the team learn together. Middle manager needs to make sure the team focuses on those things and does that in a way that doesn't separate that team from the rest of the organisation. So they'll be designing microcultures, rhythms, rituals, norms for their team. And they're doing that with a team that isn't geographically close to each other. And that makes it harder, not impossible. It means you've got to be deliberate in what you do. And deliberate is a really well-chosen word there, because it underpins everything about hybrid work, but everything also about AI and everything about middle management as well. We need to be deliberate in our actions with all of those things and not just leave it all to chance. And middle managers, they're the key to all of that.
Yeah, definitely, because it's the middle of the organization in which so many the programs of transformation, whatever,
Yeah.
succeed or fail. I mean, what do you think leaders typically underestimate then about the role that middle managers play? I mean, particularly around what you're just talking about sustaining culture and things and managing change.
There's a lot that's underestimated, and a lot of that comes from stuff we've talked about already today, like the invisible work. They're not given credit for that. They're not rewarded necessarily for that either. But if they don't do it, lots of problems flow from that. They are misunderstood, the middle managers. They are the organizational pressure valve. They're dealing with constant change. They're dealing with hybrid working, all the complexity that comes from that, the emotional support that I've mentioned already. And lots of organizations just skip over the middle when they're thinking about managers. They focus on the senior leaders, they focus on the first line managers. They're misunderstanding what a middle manager does and the value it can bring to the organization. And that's not something we should be doing, really. They are not getting the credit or the support or the development that they need. And we need to put that right.
So, if you could change kind of one thing about the way that organizations, particularly kind of more senior leaders, about how they go about developing, recognizing, empowering middle managers, what do you think would make the biggest difference? If we have some senior leaders, hopefully listening to this podcast, what do you think would be the biggest difference they can make?
There's two, because one is a mindset shift and one is a more practical thing. The mindset shift is to stop thinking of middle managers as bureaucratic blockers, overheads. They are the translators that keep work flowing. They're not average at all. They're doing some of the most complex relational work that exists in any organization. They are not the problem. They're usually the ones working around the problem, preventing the problem from getting any worse. So the mindset shift is to see them in that light. The practical stuff is to define the role in the terms of what it actually does in the organization. We mentioned before things not being on job descriptions. So that would be a good start point. Define the role in terms of what the lived reality actually is in an organization. Once you know that, you can then start channeling people towards that who show the right attitudes. You can start moving people away from that who don't. You can build development pathways and programs and other bits of support that reinforce all these things. You can anchor it in the organizational values. What you shouldn't do is just put somebody into a middle management role and hope that they'll be okay. Some will, lots won't. But unless you really prepare and support people to do that job, they will inevitably fail, and you'll begin to question the value of middle managers. And that's not their fault. That would be yours if you're a senior leader.
Okay, one final question, which is topical at the time that we are having this conversation. Um, the football teams that you and I support recently played each other.
Yep.
And for listeners outside of UK, Europe, I'm talking about soccer teams. Um, and my team is top of the league and having a fantastic season, and your team has underperformed greatly this season, and changed their manager. Um, and appointed a manager who had played for the club before and had managed, I think, at one stage before as well. And suddenly, they have literally overnight turned fortunes. They've beaten my team, who are top of the league. They've beaten the team second in the league. They kind of this new manager bounce. How does this relate? I mean, people who follow sport, are used to this, whatever sport you follow. A new manager, a new coach comes in and suddenly everything's lifted. But how does this translate into the workplace?
It's a really interesting and, like you say, very topical topic, and probably we could devote an entire podcast to this type of stuff. But new manager bounce is a thing in the sporting world, but isn't often the case in the corporate world. Without going into too much detail about what's happening at Manchester United, we have got a new manager, and we've got a manager who understands the culture of the organisation much better than the previous manager. They are an ex-employee, an alumni of the club being brought back, and therefore they come with some history, some understanding of culture and how work is done in the organisation. They've also been able, from looking from the outside, to maybe see some of the low-hanging fruit, the quick wins that could be easily put in place, the quick fixes. And in the sporting world, lots of that can happen a lot quicker than it can in the corporate world. A formation change, a personnel change, that's really quick and easy to do. In the corporate world, not so easy. But when a new manager comes in, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to change. It's not one you have to take, but it's an opportunity to examine what could change, what might have to change, and what certainly needs to stay because it's working really well. So a new manager does have that opportunity to make the team bounce, but they have to seize it. If you ignore it, if you wait a few weeks, that opportunity is probably gone. This needs to be done fairly early on. And as a new manager, I would want to be talking to existing staff about, what don't you want me to touch because it's working really well? What's the one thing that if you were in charge, you'd wave that magic wand and you would change? How do we do that? And where do we go from here? Those types of questions really important when I've been a new manager, to then harness that energy that comes from having a new leader, new manager in place, where there is a sense of new broom or the wind blowing in a different direction. People are waiting for change. You don't always have to go with it, but if a team has been down in the dumps, and Manchester United have been down in the dumps, then it's a real good opportunity to reset culturally and to reset structurally, and then go for the quick and easy wins, which Arsenal at their home ground was a quick and easy win.
No, we're not going down that route. So, Gary, it's been fascinating conversation. It's been great to talk to you again. If people want to follow up on this, what's the best way to either connect with you or to catch up on your writing?
There's a number of ways. My website is epichr.co.uk. You can also track me down on social media, mostly LinkedIn, and I'm easy to find, Gary Cookson. And then you can find most of my books on all good bookstores, Amazon, Waterstones, Goodreads, and various publishing sites.
Gary, thank you for your time.
Thank you.